Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and more importantly, welcome to Schiit Week. Yep, I've got piles of shit on my hands at the moment and I'm here to make your week a little bit shittier. So if you want to see both of the reviews of the Modius and also the Bifrost 2, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Today is the Modius review, and coming up later in the week will be the Bifrost 2. I also have the Asgard 3 coming up down the track, but I couldn't fit 3 reviews into a single week, so that one's going to happen later on. So make sure you hit that subscribe button, there's plenty of great stuff coming. The Modius is a $199 fully balanced DAC. So for those in Australia, that means it's about 280 Australian dollars, not including any shipping. At that price, it's cheaper than something like the Topping D50S, which, whilst a good DAC, is not setting the world on fire. So to have a fully balanced DAC at this price is pretty amazing if it sounds any good, and that's going to be the big question. As always, before we get into answering the question of how it sounds, let's start with talking about some of the features and functions of the Schiit Modius here. The first thing I might mention is that I've got it sitting on top of the Schiit Magnius amplifier that I reviewed here on the channel. The Magnius is a balanced amplifier designed to go specifically with the Modius. With that in mind, you can get the Modius in black. So if you're looking at this and wondering why I've got a silver product and a black product, that's just the way it worked out, because you can actually get a black version of the Modius. On that note, I want to say thank you to channel patron Richard, who let me know that the Modius and an Asgard 3 were up for sale on eBay together. I was able to snap up the deal. I'll be reviewing the Asgard 3 in future, and the Modius is making its way straight over to Richard for him to enjoy from here forward. And without giving too much away, I can say, Richard, you are going to thoroughly enjoy this DAC. So let's start with a bit of a chat about the front of the DAC. So along the front here, as with all of Schiit's DACs, we've got very, very little to look at or to touch and play with. Essentially, all you've got is a selector switch here, which is just a really nice, simple metal press button. And then you've got a series of lights which tell you which input the DAC is currently working from. I know some people have had some issues with the icons that Schiit use, thinking it's a bit difficult because the optical socket icon looks about the same shape as a USB socket. Interestingly though, with the Modius, you don't have to worry about the shape of a USB socket because it doesn't use one. Let's have a look around the back to see why that is. So on the back here, I'm going to start from the right hand side, or my right hand side, and work across, starting with a pair of XLR outputs. So as I said, this is a fully balanced DAC. We've then also got a pair of RCA outputs. So you've got single-ended and balanced from the same DAC here, which is nice. You can run 2 different amplifiers if you want to. You've then got a series of digital inputs. So we've got optical, coaxial, AES, and USB, but not as we're used to seeing it. In the case of the Modius, like its baby brother the Modi, this takes a micro USB input. There'll be those of you out there wishing that this had a full-sized USB-B socket because you might have fancy special cables like I do as well, but the reality is this is a micro USB DAC. And I think at this price it's fair enough that it's a micro USB DAC. I don't think it warrants spending a fortune on cables if you're only spending $200 on the DAC. That's not to take anything away from the performance of the Modius, just to say that I think to spend say $300, $400, $500 on a fancy USB cable to go with a $200 DAC doesn't make a huge amount of sense, given that USB cables, assuming you believe they make a difference, we'll get to that in a whole different review later on, but assuming you think they make a difference, the difference is not that much that you should be spending 2 and 3 times the cost of the DAC on those cables, in my opinion. So moving on from that for now, and then we're going to circle back around to it, the other micro USB socket that you can see here is for the power input. So with the Modius, you can run an external power supply, and it does come with a very small wall wart style supply, similar to a phone charger. I did a little bit of comparison testing because technically you can use the 5-volt feed that comes in with the same cable as the audio signal when you're using the Modius. So you can run it with a single micro USB cable coming in, or you can have 2, one for power, one for signal. Through my testing, I found that there was no significant difference jumping from no external power to using external power. And that was really interesting to me because it says to me that the power implementation within the Modius is very, very good. If you've seen my review of the P50 power supply from Topping, and indeed a number of different phone chargers that I tried with the Topping D50S, you'll know that normally, because USB power is so noisy, having an external power supply can make a huge difference. In the case of the Modius, that's just not the case. Not because it's bad either way, but because it's really good either way. Schiit's engineers have done fantastic things with the power supply design here, and they're really to be commended for it. Just to really test things out, I even used a battery power supply with the Modius and still found no significant change in sound quality. So I believe it's just a really great setup, optimized for the poor quality of USB power. So having looked at the DAC now, we understand that it's got a whole range of inputs. You've got all the different standard inputs plus AES, which I sort of consider a non-standard input given that it's not on all DACs and all devices, but you've got everything you're likely to need. And also you've got these two outputs, balanced and RCA single-ended. So this is an incredible representation of value for $199 to have all these choices available. With all that in mind, we should talk about a couple of extra things before we talk about the sound quality. The first thing I want to mention is that I was specifically asked by a viewer, and I can't remember whether it was for the Modius or the Bifrost 2 review, so I'm going to answer it on both, but I was asked about the latency of the DAC. The latency is the time it takes from the signal coming from the computer before the signal hits your ears through your headphones or your speakers. Now, in some cases like the TT2 and the M scaler over here, there can be quite a long delay. And if you're doing anything like audio editing, or in my case, video editing, it can really get in the way of jumping back and forth between the timeline, trying to find the exact moment you want to make a cut. The good news is I've used both the Modius and the Bifrost 2 for my audio editing, and in both cases I've found that there is absolutely no lag caused by the DAC, and I can very comfortably and effectively use them for that sort of work. So I'd say there's no perceptible latency there. Obviously there's going to be some because there is time for signals to travel, be decoded, etc., but it's not enough that it's actually perceptible, and they're both great for any audio or video editing type work. Something else I want to talk about is that there's been some talk thrown around about the roll-off in the Modius. So some people have said that it's quite rolled off at the top end. There's measurements around, including Schiit's own reports, that do show a roll-off. I'll put it on screen here so you can see. The roll-off is only about probably 0.2 to 0.3 of a decibel at 20 kilohertz. Now that's a really tiny amount and really hard for our ears to hear. So I wanted to do a test to prove to you that the roll-off in the Modius is really not worth worrying about. What I'm going to do now is play you a track, and I've alternated between having no roll-off and having roll-off. I'll show on screen what the settings look like. I've actually overemphasized the roll-off, so it's even worse than the Modius's roll-off. What I expect you'll hear, if you're hearing anything like what I've heard, is that the roll-off makes absolutely no difference. It's so high in the spectrum and at such a low difference level, that sort of 0.2, 0.3 decibels, that it's really not worth worrying about. And anyone who says it's a significant issue with the Modius hasn't listened to one and is not drawing the right conclusions from the data available. Hopefully you're comfortable now that the roll-off is not an issue at all with the Modius. It does not affect the sound quality at all. There's still plenty of sense of detail. And with that in mind, let's talk a bit about the sound quality of the Modius. In isolation, I've described the Modius as clean, crisp, and detailed with a good sense of space and soundstage, despite being a chip-based DAC. So what I mean by that is it's not going to reach the levels of an R2R, a multi-bit DAC like the Bifrost 2, or a chord DAC like the Qtis, the Mojo, etc. That's in terms of spatial cues. In every other way, it's really, really good, and I'd say it's better than most in terms of the soundstage and the spatial cues compared to most other chip-based DACs. As always, when I'm talking sound quality of a DAC, I do like to compare the different inputs and the different outputs to make sure there's no glaring differences. One thing I found was the coaxial input for the Modius did produce a slightly smoother sound. I probably prefer the crisper sound of the USB and the optical, which were basically identical to my ears. The spitter for some people may be preferable because it is a bit smoother and a bit more rounded, but it's going to come down to personal preference. I definitely prefer the USB and the optical, but your mileage may vary. Both are good, there's no issue with either of them, so it's not like one's great and one's terrible, they're just a little bit different. The other comparison I tried to do was with the XLRs and the RCA outputs. Now, one of the challenges I have here is that XLRs normally have twice the voltage of the RCA because of the balanced design. In this case, it's true for the Modius, and what that meant was I had to volume match between each of my switch of the outputs. As a result, I was relying on my auditory memory, which for all of us is not particularly accurate. We can do a decent job, but we need to know that there's a level of inaccuracy the moment we're relying on auditory memory. And in the case of the Modius, what I'd say is I think the XLR has ever so slightly more of a dynamic sound, a little bit cleaner sound, but the RCA was close enough that I can't definitively say it's not just as good. So we've talked about the different sound quality of the DAC by itself, but one thing I think is really important with DACs is that if they're designed well, they shouldn't have glaring and obvious sound traits. They should be to the point that you actually have to listen to them side by side to really tell the difference. Obviously with a DAC like something like maybe the Aries 2, where it's got that really expansive and richer style of presentation, that may be an exception. But for the most part, I find when I'm A/B testing different DACs, I often have to flip back and forth quite a bit before I can tell which one's which and which one I prefer. And that's the way it should be. They shouldn't be that far from one another. So I put the Modius up against a couple of other DACs to put into context just how good, or maybe not good, it actually sounds. Before I share those though, I did want to mention one last thing about the sound that I overlooked, and that is that despite being a chip-based DAC, the Modius somehow manages to avoid that digital glare or that digital edge that a lot of DACs that I've tried do. At this price point, I've tried DACs like the D50S, the D10S, the E30, even the D90. All of them have a slight amount of digital glare or edge. Even the RME ADI2 has that same edge from being a chip-based DAC. Some of them handle it better than others, so the D90 is an example of one that handles it well, whereas something like maybe the D50S doesn't do as good a job with it. So I was really impressed that at $199, whatever Schiit have done in the Modius has really smoothed off that digital edge and allowed it to be a highly enjoyable sound quality. Now that I've clarified that, let's talk some comparisons. My first comparison was pretty obvious for me given that I've got the Bifrost 2 here as well. We've got two different DACs within Schiit's range, both of which are balanced. The biggest difference has been the price. The Bifrost 2 is about 3 times the price of the Modius here. And also we've got the difference being that the Modius is a chip-based Delta Sigma DAC, whereas the Bifrost 2 is a multi-bit, similar to an R2R type approach. I can imagine a lot of people trying to work out whether it's worth spending the extra on the Bifrost 2 or just sticking with the Modius. What I found when I compared them was that they both have quite a similar sound signature and overall presentation, but you are getting what you pay for. So when you step up to the Bifrost 2, what you're getting is slightly better separation of the sounds and slightly better dynamics. That's not to suggest the Modius is any slouch. I was actually blind A/B testing these, and it took me ages flipping between the two to work out which was which. They're that close. So yes, there is a difference, but depending on your setup, the Modius might be all you need. Unless you're using higher end gear, that's going to reveal extra details in terms of spatial qualities of the music, or that little bit of extra dynamic and punch that you might be looking for from the music. Unless you've got gear that's going to reveal that, elsewhere in your sound chain, the Modius is absolutely fantastic. The one other thing that I noticed is I did feel like the Bifrost 2 delivered slightly punchier and better controlled bass. Once again though, the difference was small, so don't make your decisions based on these incremental things if you've got a relatively budget setup. This is going to be fantastic for any setup that I would consider in that budget to say mid-tier type of range. And what I'm talking about there is your DAC, your headphone amp and your headphones. If any or all of those are in that budget to mid-tier sort of range, the Modius is probably all you need. Once you start creeping above that, then you'll probably hear the Bifrost 2 showing the differences and showing the improvements that it can bring. So having identified that it is worth spending a little bit more on the Bifrost 2, or a lot more actually as the case may be, I also wanted to put the Modius up against a more direct budget comparison that's comparable in terms of price. I've recently reviewed the Loxjie D30 here on the channel, and it really won my heart. I really like the little unit. It's an all-in-one with a headphone amplifier. It's got a nice little DAC implementation in it. It's great. It's not a world beater, a giant killer, but it's a really solid little unit. And I found I preferred the DAC in that to something like the D50S, even though the D50S costs more. So I immediately thought that was a good comparison to go the DAC only in the D30, so I didn't worry about its headphone amplifier, up against the DAC in the Modius. Now keep in mind the Modius is fully balanced, the D30 is not. So this is just about the sound characteristics and the implementation of the DAC itself to compare two similarly priced products. And to me, the Modius won the challenge hands down. The D30 has quite a nice smoothness to its sound, but it was a little bit too smooth when put up against the very well managed version of the Modius' sound. What I mean by well managed is what I said before about it taking away the glare from the chip. So you're still able to get all of the detail and all the resolution, but no glare from the Modius. The D30 on the other hand, I wonder if they've gone a little bit too far in terms of smoothing things off to remove the glare, and it does take away a little bit of the resolution and detail that you perceive from the Modius compared to the D30. I found that the Modius as a result produced a more open sound. It had more space, more resolution and more detail, particularly in the upper mids into the treble. So everything felt just a little bit more open, and in comparison the D30 sounded a little bit congested compared to the Modius. Finally, I also found the Modius had a better control and punch in its bass. So similar to how the Bifrost 2 was better than the Modius, I found the Modius was better than the D30. I'm taking a punt that that comes down to the output stage quality, and that the way the output stage is designed on the Modius is better handling the control of the drivers in terms of the way the sound is delivered, particularly in the case of the bass. The other thing that I thought might be helpful in this review was to look at pairings of the Modius alongside a couple of Schiit's amplifiers. So I paired it up with the Magnius here, which is in many ways what it's designed to go with, and I also paired it up with the Asgard 3. The nice thing is, because the Modius has both balanced and single-ended outputs, I was able to connect both at once. And what I found was that both had very different sounds, as you would probably expect if you know anything about either of these two amplifiers. And if you don't, that's totally okay. I'm about to explain it. So the Magnius is a chip-based design of amplifier. It uses op-amps for the output, chip-based op-amps, versus the Asgard over here, which uses a discrete design, meaning that all the amplification is handled by individual components rather than being fed to a chip, which essentially has all those components built into the body or the structures of the chip itself. If you've seen my review of the Magnius, you'll know that I found the sound good and detailed, but a little bit artificial sounding. And that's what I often do find with chip-based amplifiers, particularly at the lower end of the price range. So let me tell you now a little bit about what I heard, firstly with the Magnius and the Modius together. I used the Meza Empyreans for this testing, and what I found was that the sound was clean and detailed, but a little bit too edgy for my tastes. There's no doubt it was more revealing and had a better sense of resolution than with the Asgard 3, but it did come at the cost of that edginess, and that led to fatigue after a while. So if I was listening to, say, 2 or 3 tracks in a row, after a while I was just finding myself not enjoying the sound as much because it was just a bit too forceful and a bit too edgy. The sound is still really good, and for a budget setup, this is going to be very, very hard to beat. But I just wanted to flag the fact that if you're not a fan of detailed and edgy sound that's a little bit in your face, then you may not prefer this setup. Instead, you might want to look at something like the Asgard 3, which has a completely different sound signature. to the Asgard 3, I paired it up with the HiFiMan Sundaras. Now I should mention I'm going to be reviewing both the HiFiMan Sundaras and the Asgard 3 later on as separate reviews, so make sure you hit subscribe if you want to hear either or both of those. The Sundaras are a much leaner sounding headphone compared to the very rich Empyreans. And while the very rich sounding Empyreans was still able to be made edgy and a touch fatiguing by the Magnius, on the flip side I was interested to see if the Sundaras, which are already quite lean and clean, if they would show any sense of edge when paired up with the Asgard 3. In some ways what I was playing with here was the synergies of the different headphones and the different amplification styles. But anyway, let's talk about the Asgard 3. The Asgard 3 is a much richer and warmer sounding amplifier compared to the Magnius. And I found the combination of the Sundaras with the Modius and the Asgard 3 a really enjoyable setup. The sound was immediately engaging, enjoyable, and it had a really nice sense of rhythm and pace to it. The Asgard 3 and the Modius combine to bring a really nice mid-range quality to the sound. And overall, I've described it in my notes as being a relaxed and enjoyable presentation. Relaxed doesn't mean it's boring or smoothed off or dull. It just means it's not edgy, it's not glary, and it lets you immerse yourself more in the music. I do think there's probably a sweet spot somewhere in between the two amplifiers, but the thing that this really showed me was that the Modius is very versatile. It hasn't got any strong characteristics that are being overplayed when paired with certain amplifiers. So any drawbacks I've just explained with both the Magnius or the Asgard 3, anything that I've said where you go, oh gee, I don't know about that, make sure you recognize that's about the amplifiers I've used here. It's not a reflection on the Modius. What I've found during my time with the Modius is it's good enough that if you pair it with better quality amplification, it's got the ability to perform better itself. It's going to scale well up to a certain point. As I said before, the Bifrost 2 is still the better product and will scale even further, but the Modius is better than it probably deserves to be for its $199 price tag. At this point, all I can say about the Modius is, to me, it is one of the best pieces of value product I've come across in a very long time. It's simple and basic, it has one function and it does that one function very well, but it's incredibly good at what it does. A $199 chip-based DAC should not have the poise and the finesse that this does. It really is a credit to Schiit's engineers that they've gotten such great sound out of this. For my money, I would not bother buying a D50, an E30, a D10, the D30 from Loxjie. None of those I would bother with, because for this price, it's the best DAC out of all of those I've just mentioned, hands down, without a doubt. Having the extra added bonus of being able to run it from a single USB cable with no power supply if you don't want to is just an added bonus. So if that all sounds good to you and you want to know more about the Modius, I'll put a link down below through to Schiit's website where you can take a look and also purchase it, of course, if you're interested. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you want to watch the second part of Schiit Week, the Bifrost 2 review. And other than that, happy listening, and I'll look forward to seeing you here next time on Passion for Sound.